Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we are back with another interview. This time, we're going to talk about a perfect future. I'll admit it, I'm an optimist about our ability to respond to and end the climate crisis. I think humanity tends to prepare itself for the problems it's going to face, often problems we create ourselves. But we are ready to do this. We have to think about how to map a path forward. And our guest today, Chunka Mui, is the co-founder of Future Histories Group. He just co-wrote a new book, A Brief History of a Perfect Future, Inventing the World That We Can Proudly Leave to Our Kids by 2050. He co-wrote it with Paul Carroll. He's a former reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal, and Tim Andrews, who is with the consultancy Booz Allen Hamilton that advises many of the largest brands in the world. Now, they crafted a vision, or maybe the best way to describe it is a description of a process for evolving our society and technology to achieve an environmentally sustainable and just world. A Brief History of a Perfect Future describes how computation, telecommunications, and information can help to tune the waste out of our economy, while innovations in genomics, energy, water management, and transportation can deliver improved health and sustainable use of our limited resources. Their vision is far-ranging, and I encourage you to read and decide for yourself about A Brief History of a Perfect Future. Do it with a skeptical but open mind, and I think you're going to find that there are many paths through the climate and equity crisis that we face. Welcome to the show, Chunka. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining us, and it was a pleasure to read your book. Let me start off with this. You begin by pointing to Alan Kay's dictum that says that the best way to predict the future is to go ahead and invent it yourself. Alan was a fellow at I'm going to blank on it now. Xerox PARC, and he contributed to, amongst other things, the creation of the Macintosh and a particularly seminal vision for the future called the Knowledge Navigator, which described an information device a lot like a smartphone today.
Yes.
So here's my question. Who do you see building all these breakthroughs? Where are these solutions going to come from?
Well, I mean, there are collective solutions. They require the interaction of individuals, organizations, governments. It's an all hands on deck kind of situation, as you often talk about. So there's no silver bullet. There's no savior. It's about whether or not we can essentially rally enough of all of us around these solutions.
Do you think this is something that, we tend to think in the United States that we lead the world, but this is a global and distributed problem. Will the U.S. be able to lead, or do we need to partner with researchers and innovators around the planet?
Well, as you often talk about, I mean, there are no borders around the climate. Mm-hmm. And we have to sort of collectively work towards this. The U.S., of course, is key because it's such a large part of the global economy, both from a consumption and a supply standpoint. And a lot of great innovations start from here, or at least are key, from a science to technology standpoint in the U.S. But it definitely has to be a global effort.
Humans are just historically wasteful.
Yes.
And you really make a great case for the idea of accelerating progress towards complete efficiency using a variety of technologies. So how has the world changed, say, since 1970, when the internet was introduced, 1969, that gives you hope for our ability to pull together using technology?
Well, I think the unfortunate short answer is that it hasn't.
Okay.
But I think what has changed are the sort of technological capabilities that we can use as building blocks to a better approach. Mm-hmm. I think waste certainly is a massive issue. But the question is, what problem do we have to solve in this long term? And I think sort of the existential problem facing us is 51 billion tons of carbon emissions each year and rapidly rising. So, what we deal with in the book, when we talk about climate, is how do we get rid of the 51 billion? Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, if it takes a little more waste to get rid of the 51 billion, which I don't think it does, then I'll take a little more waste, but I want to get rid of the 51 billion tons of carbon emissions when I deal with climate.
So you're talking about trade-offs.
Yep.
What kinds of trade-offs do we need to be thinking about as a society today? And you mentioned consumption being one of the the keys to changing the trajectory of our society's environmental impact?
Well, I think one of the key trade-offs we're going to have is dealing with how do we pull people out of poverty while at the same time we save all of us from climate change. So, for example, there are essentially almost 1 billion people living in energy poverty. Those folks are worried about whether or not they feed their children and keep the lights on or have lights at all.
Right.
And it's hard to posit a future for them that doesn't allow them to do that. Right. So we have to somehow deal with the energy issue at the same time we deal with the dirty energy issue at the same time we deal with the lack of energy issue. And those could be posed as trade-offs, or we could find some way where they're not.
Well, give me an example of how they might not be requiring a trade-off.
Well, I mean, as we talk about in the book, the advancement of renewable energy, solar, wind, and such, is progressing at such a rapid pace. It already is in many parts of the world cheaper to build new solar than to operate existing coal, right? So we have to invest in those kinds of things, which take a longer term investment because you have to change out the infrastructure so that the future gets us to an answer that we want. So, if we're trying to get to the moon, the first thing we do is not to build more ladders, right? We have to figure out what is the process for getting to the moon and what are the capabilities that we need. And sometimes those are different courses than we're taking today.
So you also focus on the idea of the law of zero, which is essentially extending the ideas of Moore's law, for instance. You get a lot more computational power every 18 months, roughly
right.
as much for half the price. And that has reduced the cost of computation fantastically. In order to, and you see this going on in energy and in other areas, how does the law of zero deliver an egalitarian and small d democratic society when between now and 2050, the time frame for your book, we may be in a real struggle over resources?
Yeah, well, I think in one way, humanity has lucked out, right? In the sense that you could think about the problems we have with climate as a byproduct of the amazing advances of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the secondary effect of that led us to climate change is the fact that we had this great, cheap energy, highly efficient fossil fuel. So we have this opportunity to change out the kind of energy we want because of advances in science in a way that both reduces costs and reduces emissions. So the way we deal with egalitarianism is essentially what the laws of zero give us is over time, cheaper and cheaper, better resources. So we can both address energy poverty and dirty energy at the same time.
So one of the other things that happens when this sort of efficiency is introduced, and it started in the industrial era, but is much more pronounced today, is that you get fantastic concentrations of wealth as well.
Yeah.
How do you justify the potential for an Elon Musk to make $200 billion over the course of a decade, when so many other people are struggling just to get by? Do we need to rethink the way that we reward innovation? Well,
the only reason Elon Musk is worth $200 billion is because he gives us, he's sort of the best example of a viable path to the transition of the energy sector, of the transportation sector. Mm-hmm. He's not really worth $200 billion. He's worth the promise of that solution.
He's an excellent marketer.
He's an excellent marketer, and quite frankly, he was willing to do things that the incumbents weren't willing to do. Mm-hmm. Right? He didn't do it alone. I mean, the only reason Tesla accounts for less than 1% of global market share of new vehicles. But we all know that we have to change the other 99% to electric vehicles very, very quickly. And he holds the promise of selling those vehicles. And so investors are saying, so we're backing him. But what they're really backing is electric vehicles. Right. And if he slips, they'll back somebody else, and most of that money will disappear. I personally hope he doesn't slip because we need the electric vehicles as quickly as possible. But you know what? I'm willing to give him $200 billion if we can solve climate change. And I'm willing for him to invest that somewhere else, to build more wealth. So I think we can solve both of these problems. So for example, one of the greatest determiners of health and wealth is access to cheap transportation.
Right.
You can't get to jobs, you don't have a job. You can't get to the hospital, you don't have good health care. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we posit with Law of Zero in transportation is that these capabilities over time will drive down the marginal costs of transportation. And that will by itself spread the wealth and increase egalitarianism. I don't think in the near term, we're going to be able to really deal with the concentration of wealth from a technological standpoint. Actually, I think technology actually enables the growth of a lot more wealth, as you've seen in your industry. And how the government, the markets sort of distribute that is still a challenging question.
Well, and we certainly over-index on the inequalities. If you look at what has happened globally, and Hans Rosling's work on
absolutely
looking at this optimistically was very important. It's too bad he passed when he did. We could use him now, but the idea. If you look back, the number of people we've lifted out of poverty,
absolutely.
Incredible.
Yeah.
But so we were talking about this sort of bold leader like an Elon Musk, who we're counting on to disrupt things. But when we talk about environmental and particularly genetics issues, do we need to exercise a precautionary principle and require a lot more testing before somebody can just push something out into the marketplace?
Absolutely. Well, I think what we need to require is responsibility, mm-hmm. right? We need and Hans made this argument as well that in general, most engineers are responsible, and most of the fruits of engineering are very, very distributed. So I think what we need is responsibility on the part of the inventors, reinforced by policy and by consumers, right? It's this interaction between the supply and demand of right. innovation that will address these kinds of issues. But I think, as you just said, we can't over-index on the negative outcomes and lose out on the positive benefits.
So, thinking about those benefits and the opportunity to spread them more widely, if we require responsibility to whom? And this goes back to the global or the United States issue too. Whose rules do we use to judge responsibility?
Oh, we don't have philosopher kings on it either, national or global standpoint. This is the pug. And then the reality is the tug and pull of personal interest, national interest, individual interest. Now, one of the things that we spent a lot of time in the book, these ideas of future histories, is that unless we can get out of the noise and the battles of right now and posit narratives, essentially, that we can all sort of rally around, then we'll be caught in the bitter local battles and not necessarily get to, the future. So, actually, as you opened the interview, talking about your optimism, I'm not actually as optimistic as you. I'm actually a little pessimistic, which is why we wrote this book, right? Which is, unless we can posit those long-term, futures that is worth us collectively working towards, we're mm-hmm. going to keep on battling like crazy.
Agreed. And my optimism is a skeptical optimism.
Yes.
I think we shouldn't just say, oh, it's the future, let's take it. We should right. really judiciously talk through where we want to go.
Right. Exactly. And I don't think humanity actually rises to challenges. It rises to potential solutions. They rise to potential solutions. Yeah. And we're sociological beings. And it's sort of like we're still caving around the campfire. We have to have a story to tell each other to rally ourselves towards that collective good. So most of our book talks about great building blocks in terms of technology, mm-hmm. But the building blocks aren't the buildings. What the future histories are is a construction of the kinds of buildings that we could build. But we also talk about the awful buildings that might otherwise arise if we don't proactively work towards the future perfect.
Well, and that raises a good example from the book. You talk about something, one of your future histories is a future pathetic, really where we don't want to go. And right. and the question I had as I was reading about the comprehensive instrumentation of society, because we have technology now that can tell us all about what's going on around us, also presents the prospect of endless surveillance.
Yeah.
And this is an area where particularly our listeners want to make good choices about their life and freedom as well as their prosperity, but it's difficult to find those trade-offs in terms of what I'm willing to give up or share in terms of my personal information to get a better outcome. How do we avoid the future pathetic in terms of the introduction of comprehensive monitoring of experience in life?
Well, this is another one of those situations where we don't want to over-index on negative. But, I think as we wrote up on the book, this whole notion of trust in technology, trust in policy, trust in each other, I mean, they require some building blocks. The ones we talk about are things like authentication,
right,
privacy, security, triangulation, right? So these things that can allow us to build systems that verify, trust but verify each other. And we have these amazing capabilities. My co-author Tim Andrews talks about this all the time, so he won't mind if I do as well. Tim's a type 1 diabetic, right? He depends on his insulin pumps, right? And he has. I've known him for 30 years, and his ability to use advances in medical technology to treat his type 1 diabetes has been miraculous. There are privacy and security and issues around that technology, but you know what? He really has to regulate his insulin or his blood sugar,
sure.
And we have to look at that level. At the level, what problem are we solving, and what are the issues with that, and how do we take advantage of these advances to solve those problems, while factoring in issues like authentication, verification, security, privacy, all those kinds of things. They have to be dealt with at a finer level.
Now, you also talk a lot about the application of artificial intelligence to solving these problems. And as I was thinking about this, there's again, and not to always cast this as a choice, but there's the opportunity to be coached and helped towards becoming our best self. But AI needs itself to have a control that prevents them from becoming tyrannical. How do we have that dialogue, and how do we bring ordinary people who are making just buying decisions at home into this advisory system that's going to allow us to rapidly and exponentially improve our social efficiency?
Yeah. Well, I think the same issues around authentication, privacy, security, and transparency around where that data comes from, and the potential for bias they have to be on the table and discussed openly.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, for example, that one of the issues with artificial intelligence is the inherent bias of the data sets you're using for that kind of analysis. Well, we can have transparency on data sets. We need to have transparency on data sets. We can mandate that, or as consumers, we can demand it. I mean, there are people working, for example, on certification systems for data sets. We also know that because of the spread of technology, what we call the law of zero information, more and more information is going to be readily accessible. So we can actually have better and better data sets. We can have pharmaceutical trials that are representatives of the population that are going to use the drugs, not just, over-index on the people that we can get to. So in some ways, the advances that we postulate in the book will address some of those issues, and even more, give us the capability for addressing those issues in a transparent way.
And what I see is that particularly Generation Z, having grown up entirely digitally native, has an inclination to look into questions much more deeply than their parents or grandparents did, because they've always had that access to information and expectation. And one of the other main points is this notion of distributed systems. We can self-organize locally, regionally, nationally, globally, but there's always options within that because of the distributed networks that exist. And that the energy grid is your great example of this. Tell us about how the distribution of the energy grid is going to create a new infrastructure on which we can solve our energy problems without having to go back to the old system and try to fix it.
Well, if you look, for example, in the next 30 years, the fastest growing continent will be Africa, right? There is no reason why the African economy, built on the rapidly advancing energy technologies and solar and wind, there's no reason why they need to replicate, centralized grids. We could actually adopt solar in a lot of solar and wind in a lot of regions without the central grid, right? So distributed systems as you described. So building the right infrastructure for the new technology, as opposed to replicating the infrastructure for the old. Now, we still have to deal with the grid as it stands, and we're going to have to modernize it. And we're going to have to get, solar and wind from, to deal with seasonal variances, right? In Seattle, it's darker in the winter than it is in the summer, right? And you're going to have to deal with what's the right level of renewables versus long range transmission lines, things of that sort. So we have this massive problem in transformation of electric grid, the centralized electric grid, but we don't have to replicate that everywhere.
Well, and looking at Africa, it's amazing. They leapfrogged us because they never had a physical telecommunications infrastructure.
Right, exactly.
Everything is wireless. It's a very different world over there. But here in the States, where we do have this very entrenched establishment infrastructure, what do you recommend we do to help move that forward, other than look for people like Elon Musk who are going to kick the tires and change things? Well,
Elon Musk we have to recognize,
maybe I'm over Eloning. Sorry.
Yeah, but he's a great example because he's sort of the person at the end of a long stream of really important work, right? Elon and Tesla would not exist if it weren't for decades of government investment in battery technology. Elon and Tesla would not exist if they literally hadn't gotten a loan that kept them from bankruptcy. They wouldn't exist if we didn't have governmental policy that gave enormous incentives to consumers for buying electric vehicles, right? So we have to do all of those things in these areas. Now, in the energy issue in the U.S., we have this amazing opportunity in front of us. More than 50% of the energy we generate is wasted.
Right.
Right.
Well, how would you change that today? What would you do today?
Well, I start the long process of fixing the problem.
Right. Where would you start, though?
Well, there are people already working on system-wide simulations of the energy system, understanding what the transformation of the system needs to be in 5-10 years in order to reduce that kind of waste, that kind of efficiency, and how to bring in new sources. That is hard work. That's not inventing a better cell. That's mapping out this complex system and how we evolve that. And that is not an individual effort. That's a governmental effort.
And that goes back to this bigger question, these models.
Yes.
We finally have the capacity to build because and they're still incomplete, but we can build them now. We have virtual Earth, so we can look at the environmental systems, at the infrastructure, at governance. When do you expect to see clear signs that perfect future is starting to emerge out of all this activity? Do you have a moment that you would say, if we haven't made it by now, we're in real trouble? Or do you see those things already coming over the horizon that give you hope?
I think it's a cascade of moments. I don't think there's one pivot point. I think it's to an old phrase, it's 1,000 points of light, right? That has to be done. We're seeing this battle right now in the infrastructure bill. Most of the infrastructure bill is fixated on 20th century infrastructure. Yeah. With a few drops here and there for the future. If we can, once we start seeing more drops into the future, then we can be more optimistic. But I think we got a long slog in front of us. And, I noticed you said the same thing in the description of your podcast that I said in my book, which is that it's for our children and our grandchildren. Yeah. What are we going to do, for those generations, and how can we sort of take those big steps now for the long progress that we need to make?
Well, I completely agree, because we keep looking back and trying to fix something that is literally predicated on what happened in 1850, rather than what happens to happen in 2050. So, what advice do you have for our listeners? And some of this is you go through advice for a lot of different types of entities. People in the book, but what advice do you have for our listeners who are thinking about their role as citizens, customers, employees, leaders? What should they do today?
Join a local school board or a local public utility commission.
Okay.
Right. Because, There are thousands of entities that make up sort of these policy and structural kinds of decisions. How do we teach our kids to think about systems?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How do we motivate the local and state regulating bodies to start making those little changes? So as individuals, as citizens, as employees, as consumers, we're making all these decisions that collectively everything else hinges on. And of course, we make up the organizations and we make up the governments. So we have to get serious about what our individual vision of that 30-year future we want for our kids to be, and ask ourselves, what are the one or two things I can do all the time to make that happen? Everybody carries around, we talk about in this book, everybody carries around a to-do list for today and this week. We could carry around a to-do list for, what are the things we can do today or this week or next week that might affect that long-term future.
So thinking in terms of the environment when making those decisions, is that one of the core recommendations that you have? Or thinking in terms of human prosperity, or thinking in terms of the planet's health? How would you base your next decision as a consumer, for instance?
The way we describe in the book is think about that slice of the future that you care the most about and do something about it. So, is your next burger going to be a plant-based burger versus a beef burger? Is your next car going to be an electric vehicle versus internal combustion engine? Those are choices people are making every day.
Yeah, right?
Every day. And you know what? So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this, but I recommend everybody go take a look at A Brief History of the Perfect Future. It really is a way to start to think through these problems. And I want to thank you, Chunka, for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We've been talking with Chunka Mui, who is the co-author of A Brief History of a Perfect Future, Inventing the World We Can Proudly Leave to Our Kids by 2050. It's available on Amazon and at independent bookstores. We'll have links in the article that accompanies this podcast. Folks, please take a few minutes to share this podcast and others that come from Earth911, or any that you find valuable in the conversation about the environment and sustainability. Let's get these ideas out there. Let's change this world. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we are going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.